Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to Destination the Show, episode 2. My name is Jamie Cameron here with my guy Jeremy Nygaard for our second ever episode. Jeremy, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm good. The weather was hot and now it's not as hot, but I'm good. I'm ready to do this. You had your little thing yesterday and now we're back on board.
A little thing, if you're wondering, is sitting down to record last night in the feels like 105-degree day and having a power cut, AC, and everything that you could possibly want to keep you comfortable going out at about 9 p.m. So it was a rough evening, but here we are. We're back. Um, First, want to start out by thanking folks for checking us out. Thank you guys for listening. If you're brand new to the show, welcome. We are brand new too. In this episode, we got a lot to talk about. Um, Here's what we're going to cover. Uh, MLB Pipeline and Baseball America dropped brand new organizational talent rankings in the last week, new farm system rankings from both. So we're going to dig into the org talent rankings for the Twins, Cubs, and Brewers. We're going to spend some in the weeds time talking about the Cubs draft. We're going to review that in a little more depth. And then we'll finish up like we did last week with some listener questions, some news, and notes. But before we get to all that, a couple of quick housekeeping items. We are now on Twitter. The podcast has a Twitter handle. It's at DTS underscore pod one, like the number one. So drop us a follow if you're on Twitter. And also, because we're a multi-team podcast, some of the helpful feedback that we got from episode 1 was folks were interested in timestamps so they could tune in and out of the teams that they were most interested in. So you'll be able to find those for episode 2, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you access your podcasts. That way you can plug more directly into content for your specific team. Third thing, we're looking for feedback. The first few episodes, obviously, we're finding our feet. We're trying to figure out exactly what works, what people like, and what people don't. So we want to hear from you. If there's something about the show that you really liked, please let us know. If there's something you want to see for a future show, let us know. We are super open to feedback. The big news from episode 1. Jeremy, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Destination the Show is currently ranked as the number 72 baseball podcast on
Oh,
iTunes.
that's right, baby.
Dubious honor, number 72. The only way is up. So thank you guys for real though for checking out the show. We really appreciate it. We really appreciate the feedback and the engagement and the questions and all that good stuff. If you enjoy what you hear tonight, we would super appreciate if you leave us a positive 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Twins Daily YouTube channel. That will help us grow the show and spread the word. All right, Jeremy, you ready to dig into farm system rankings?
Always ready.
Okay, let's do it. So, a quick couple of points of context here before we dig into some discussion. So, MLB Pipeline and Baseball America released updated farm system rankings, fully aware that other outlets have since released theirs. We chose to, while we're prepping the running order for the show tonight, here's the rankings. Here's kind of an overview of where things are at. MLB Pipeline first, and we'll start with the NL Central. Milwaukee Brewers, number 3 farm system in all of baseball. Chicago Cubs, number 4 farm system in all of baseball. Other NL Central teams: Pittsburgh Pirates, number 2. Cincinnati Reds, number 5. Hope we're seeing a trend here. St. Louis Cardinals, number 22.
Yeah.
Cry me a river. AL Central for Pipeline. Minnesota Twins at number 17, middle of the pack. Other AL Central teams, Tigers at 13, Guardians at 15, White Sox at 20, Royals at 29. Got to come back to the Royals and talk about them a little bit more in a second.
Absolutely.
Baseball America, Brewers number 2, Cubs number 6, and then the other NL Central teams, Pirates number 4. They were a little bit lower on the Cincinnati Reds at number 12, and then Cardinals at 21. And then for Baseball America, for the AL Central, Twins at 17. They have the Guardians at 13, Tigers at 16, White Sox 22, and Royals 29 again. Sad trombone.
Yeah.
Jeremy, overall reactions and thoughts about these rankings, anything specifically jump out to you?
Well, the first thing that I appreciate is that being a Wisconsin native, I have a lot of Brewers friends. And being a draft guy, I have a lot of Brewers friends that ask questions about the Brewers drafts, right? Mm-hmm. And I always seem to be a fan of how the Brewers draft. And so when they're as high as they are, 2 and 3, it makes me feel good about my opinions because I like their drafts. And then, I mean, most of their prospects are added through the draft. Obviously, their top prospect wasn't, but for the most part, it's a draft heavy. They haven't traded for a lot of those guys. So I really like that. The Cubs, they've come about it more through trades. And so it's been different. The Reds obviously are one of those teams that are going to fall because those prospects are becoming non-prospects, which is super exciting for the Reds because they brought up all those dudes. Unfortunately for Twins fans, many former Twins prospects, but that's been really fun. And then it's for Cardinals fans, it's kind of been a little depressing because they're not having a season. They've held on to their older dudes when they could have maybe replenished their system. And they're just not playing good baseball, right? The Central the AL Central. It's funny because it's a trash division.
So bad.
And their farm systems, for the most part, are below average. So I did find it funny, the Royals with the 29th ranked in both, right? So we're talking almost dead last. And Dayton Moore is apparently in the running to go take the job with the White Sox and screw them up.
Please, I beg you. Please go.
That's a bad idea. And so, the Guardians have a way of doing things, and I never really doubt how they do things because they tend to have success with not all their, without putting a ton of money in. And so, as a Twins fan, I like seeing that, but what does this matter? It doesn't so much because unless you have top end talent, those numbers, they just represent depth sometimes, but it doesn't even take into account how many of the age of the major league team, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I think the future of the team always sounds better when you have a higher ranking, right? And so that lends itself to, some positive future thoughts. But really, it's just people liking recent drafts and liking the trades that you've made and having success in your system.
Yep. And that point you brought up about the Reds is interesting, that a number of their top prospects have graduated, because I think you can make a decent comparison to the Twins there, who have really relied on this fast-moving, can reach the major leagues relatively quickly. Like Brooks Lee is obviously an excellent example of that, where they're never going to be more than the middle of the pack because they're usually half decent as a major league product, but also because of their drafting preferences. I'm glad you brought up the Royals. I was going to save this for later, but seeing as you brought it up, we got to dig into it now. Because this is astonishing to me. The Royals do not have a single top 100 prospect per MLB Pipeline or Baseball America. Given how incredibly bad they have been in recent seasons, that seems just like absolutely unfathomable. I do not understand.
Yeah, well, they went through their stretch where they kind of tried to float some guys, maybe took guys lower than, or higher than the consensus would have had them. If we would have
Mm-hmm.
had the consensus board back then, we could have really taken a deep dive. We didn't, so it's really hard to say. But I mean, I'm looking at their top group of prospects, and it's like, wow, this is a sad group. And the ETAs on these guys, they're not close.
Oh.
So it's all projection. And obviously, depending on who's doing the rankings, if you view projectable guys as lesser than the on the doorstep guys, that hurts
Mm-hmm.
you. But Blake Mitchell right now is their number one prospect. And I can't imagine that there's a lot of teams. And Blake Mitchell, I thought was drafted high at 8, right?
For sure. For
So
sure.
there's not a lot of teams that you draft a guy and he becomes your number one prospect. This year's different because you had Cruz, you had Skeens, you had
Mm-hmm.
Langford, you had Clark, you had Jenkins. Like those guys should all be number one in most systems.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, nobody should have been number one in any system.
Yep.
And Blake Mitchell, who was overdrafted at 8, is their immediate number one according to MLB. And that's just like,
That's wild.
uh,
It's
it's sad.
icky. Felt kind of bad for Royals fans while we're all complaining about fragile Twins bullpens and the like. So let me ask you this then. So trend so far, NL Central and the AL Central moving in pretty different directions. Both divisions have been a little stinky this year, but the NL Central is absolutely loaded with talent. We've seen Paul Skeens promoted to Double A this week. That's pretty fun. If you were in the position to um, rank farm systems yourself, if you were in charge of BA's rankings or pipelines rankings, what are you thinking about and what are you prioritizing the most as you rank organizational talent? Are you looking for like superstar upside? Are you looking for depth? How do you think about stacking up farm systems against each other?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think everybody has their own unique way of doing things. Um, when I've ranked the twin system recently, it's always about stars on the top, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that not necessarily a single team or whoever you're looking at. If you have the top 50 global prospects, whether they're 17 years old in Double A or they're 22 years old in Triple A, those are the guys that start and that you compare to the other teams. And
Mm-hmm.
so that to me is the Jackson Trios, the Walker Jenkins, the Brooks Lee types. Pete Crow Armstrong, I think is certainly in that mix, right? But then as you get down, and how you do it, how I do it would certainly be different. I tend to always lean towards upside.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm more likely to rank the guy that just signed for $3.5 million higher than I am to rank the guy that is kind of unheard of but killing it in Double A without
Yep.
any fanfare. And I don't know, the only reason I know that I do that is because when we compile lists and that's what I hear, it's like, wow, I thought I was a fan of upside. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and I think part of that is it gives you hope for the year after year after year after year, and it makes it more fun to watch how these guys are doing at the lower levels. Um, is that better? Is having guys with high upside better than having a ton of depth? Like that, I think that's kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it's interesting how these rankings are somewhat consistent between two major outlets. Um, but I think when it comes down to it, there always kind of forms the consensus where you can be high on a guy or low on a guy, but it's not really going to change that much. If you peg him as a future all-star and I peg him as a future regular, that's a pretty small gap compared to future all-star and not going to make it. And so I
Yep.
think guys, you reach a consensus on guys relatively early, maybe too early. Um, and I think a ton of emphasis is put on your highest draft picks,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you're a first round pick and you're average, you're going to get way more leeway than if you're a 15th round pick and you kill it, and then you're not very good, and then and so I think there's a trend in that, right or wrong, and so there's a lot of ways, but I like, to summarize, I always err on the side of projection.
Yep. Makes sense. I think I'm with you overall, actually. And I think like a lot of the discourse I've seen on the Twitters of these three teams actually this season is a lot around like, well, we want to see a guy play first and establish some kind of arc of performance before putting all of our stock in him, like Walker Jenkins is a good example, who we'll talk about a little bit later. But I think I tend to err overall on the same side as you, and value upside, because I think if you ask someone who was responsible for a draft, so we'll take Sean Johnson as an example, I think what they would say is, in the draft, we're looking to not only get as much talent into the organization as possible, but we're looking to get the most impactful talent into the organization as we possibly can. And so that's why I think we see that heavy emphasis on earlier picks, and also why I tend to hone in on overall ceiling and overall upside a little bit more, even though obviously the risk is there. So let's talk about the Brewers and the Cubs systems a little bit more, because they are better. They're both, like, the Brewers absolutely a top 5 system right now. Cubs somewhere in the 5 to 10 range, kind of as an average across platforms. Jeremy, I'm wondering if you can give me a Brewers guy who you think is really interesting, and a Cubs guy who you think is really interesting. Tell us a little bit about them, why you think they're a prospect worth tracking, and then I'll clap back with a couple of my own.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the Brewers have some really exciting prospects at the top, but in just looking around and the things that I like, again, I'm looking high upside, not necessarily close to the pros. And the guy that really sticks out for me for the Brewers is Luis Laura, undersized outfielder, international guy that was signed in 2022, and he wasn't the top of that international free agency group, but has just really, really done well. He's 18 years old, recently promoted to low A, or excuse me, high A ball. And so he's the equivalent of a recently drafted high school senior, right? We talk about Walker Jenkins drafted by the Twins. Luis Laura is that same age, switch hitter, 5'7", 155. So we're talking someone that's likely to be a center fielder, a leadoff type guy. He steals a lot of bases. Here he's, I think he's probably, I don't know if that's a home run or not, but a nice swing.
Really nice, compact.
Right now, in combined with the two levels, batting 285, has only 2 home runs in 295 at bats, 40 walks, 51 strikeouts, 24 stolen bases. Nice. And when you think about, and I think the reason that I like him even more in the Brewer system is he's not going to have to be the guy that provides the home runs, right? They have other guys that do that. He's the guy that can get on base, score the runs. And the other thing that I think is always possible when you have a very small, diminutive outfielder is second base might be a place. The Ben Revere thing, like, he doesn't have the arm. I mean, that guy could barely throw the ball from left field to the
barely.
And so for me, that was all. He's the type of player that he's not going to get a ton of fanfare right away. But when you take a guy, international signing 2022, all the way up to high A as an 18-year-old, that to me is exciting. Switching over to the Brewers, from the Brewers to the Cubs, again, I'm going upside. And last year, Jackson Ferris was a one of the top prep pitchers available, and they went with Cade Horton, who had the rise in the College World Series.
Mhm.
And they turned around and gave Jackson Ferris a boatload of money as a second round pick,
Mhm.
or a comp pick, whatever he was. I think it's 47th overall. Big lefty, 6'4", and they're just, when you have a high school guy, we've talked about it with high school guys this year. When you have a big projectable high school guy, the ceiling is like, oh yeah, he could be the greatest pitcher ever.
Mhm.
Right? He could be also someone that never pans out and is terrible, which is fine, because if you have the potential to be a top of the rotation starter, that's huge. And Ferris is, top 10-ish in the system. For me, he's a top 5-ish guy right now, with the potential to be the top guy, but also the potential to go the way of Forrest Whitley and not be anything.
Yep.
Right. And so, you know,
Gives them a
it's just
1.3
it's
whip.
fun
Break
to
even
watch
stop.
big lefties
Got
get
the hit,
after it.
down goes
Yeah.
Niven, so
And
almost hit a
the
home
the
run,
value of
but
being a left-handed
gives
pitcher,
them
if
a
you end up as a two-pitch
1.3
guy,
whip. Break even
there's
stop.
still the
Got the
future
hit, down
of being
goes Niven,
something
so almost hit a
that's
home run, but
productive. And so I really like him for Chicago. He just seems like a big market kind of guy, IMG guy. So he was my pick for the Cubs. And I liked him in the draft. I think that's kind of how I always err. So those are my choices. Where are you going?
Okay, so I'm gonna say I like your picks. I'm gonna take a leaf out of your book from last week, which is, as you go blurry, which is to choose some of the most obvious guys, but guys that are absolutely my favorites. And I really want to hone in on pitching, because I think the Brewers and Cubs have two of the most interesting and unique pitching prospects in all of baseball right now. So we'll start with the Brewers. And these are both, I'll preface this by saying these are both, very obvious picks, but I'm okay with that. My Brewers pick is going to be Jacob Mizorowski. He has, if anyone saw the Futures game this year, he was the absolute star of the show. He came in throwing 101, just the nastiest possible stuff. And before we dig into some of his numbers, which are absolutely ridiculous, my favorite piece of Jacob Mizorowski trivia is that he was an arm that the Brewers drafted out of JUCO, which is a fun, interesting niche that they're incredibly good at exploiting. And he was actually committed to LSU. So there's an alternate reality in which Jacob Mizorowski would be the weekend starting pitching partner of Paul Skeens in the 2023 College World Series, which would have been absolutely incredible. Mizorowski's been at 3 different levels this year. Started at A ball. The strikeout numbers are like gaudy. If you're a K per 9 person, we're just watching video of him absolutely destroy hitters at the moment. If you're a K per 9 guy, his K per 9 numbers at single A were 15.53 Ks per 9. He's now at double A, 15.43 Ks per 9. There is, I think, some reliever risk here, right? Absolutely, throwing strikes is the challenge. He's walking 4 or 5 now. He's up to 6 guys per 9 at double A. He has settled in after a really rough start, but in terms of just explosive, nasty stuff, at the very worst, you have an absolutely dominant back end arm to add to the Milwaukee bullpen. If he can figure out how to throw enough strikes, he is going to be an absolute monster. And he was someone no one was talking about going into the draft. He was a JUCO arm. So incredible find by the Brewers. They're really, we'll do an in-depth draft review for them this week, and I don't think it's a secret that might be Jeremy and my favorite draft of the 3 that we're covering this year. My Cubs guy, Going back to the 2022 draft is going to be Cade Horton, who was
Love it.
drafted.
Love
Yeah,
it.
yep. So let's just re-engage in a little bit of the 2022 draft context, right? Cade Horton had this like incredible stretch run for Oklahoma where he took them to the College World Series. He just looked like an absolute monster. And he really like vaulted himself into kind of middle first round conversation in that draft. And then the Cubs took him at 7, and that was a huge surprise. In the 2022 draft, that was kind of like a clear 6 guys, and Kevin Parada was one. The guy the Reds took, his name is escaping me
Cam
at the moment.
Collier.
Yeah, Collier was another guy that ended up being left on the board. But the Cubs sprung a surprise and took Horton at 7, and he has just had an incredible season. It's looking like an absolute dynamite pick. So we're watching video of him now. He has also seen 3 levels this year, A, high A, and double A. Hasn't really skipped a beat at any of them. He's carrying a FIP of 2.49 at double A right now, striking out almost 11 guys per 9, not really walking anybody. Velocity's there, kind of a starter's frame type of a guy. And I think the thing that's great about Horton is he's going to be ready next year. And he's at this perfect kind of intersection where he's dominated a couple of levels this year already. And to be clear, he should have dominated low A and even high A, given his pedigree as a college starter. But he's putting up the same type of numbers at double A. Really impressive. He's also working on kind of expanding his pitch mix, his pitch repertoire, adding new pitches to what he has to offer. And the Cubs can use help in their rotation. I think Cade Horton is going to be an absolute monster for them, and he is going to debut sometime in 2024. So those are my guys. I realize they are a little bit more obvious than your guys, but overall, I think we got a good balance.
Yeah, and the thing about Horton too is at Oklahoma, he was a two-way guy.
Yep.
Like he was maybe not more highly regarded, but I think more highly regarded as a third baseman for the most part until he started to throw. I think there was some injury stuff in there too, but really just came onto the radar and exploded. And from my perspective, it was Cade Horton and Connor Prelip both had these kind of short track records.
Yep.
And Dylan Lesko. So there was like 3 guys for me that were like, if you want a pitcher, maybe these are the guys you choose from. Fortunately, Brooks Lee falls into the Twins' lap. Prelip falls into their lap again, has more arm issues. But the Cubs able to take Horton and turning into a really good pick, and then turning around and using more money to get Ferris is expensive. Speaking of money, I apparently need to invest in a better.
What is going on with your camera?
It's the same one you have, right?
If you are watching the video version of this and you feel like blurry Jeremy is preferable to sharply contrasted Jeremy, just let us know and we'll make sure that happens on future episodes.
Just turn the camera off.
Yeah, 100%, 100% agree. One thing I think that's also should be mentioned about Horton is he's about like the only top 100 prospect who's a pitcher who's been healthy for the entire season. He's one of very, very few. Almost everyone has had injury issues and challenges in what is like a top 100 that has seen a ton of turnover this year. So he's my guy. I'm excited to see him debut next year to see what he has. Okay, we're going to move on. We're going to move on from farm systems. We are going to dig into the Chicago Cubs 2023 draft. Thank you to a couple of folks who sent me thoughtful and useful feedback last week after episode 1. And they said, you know what? We need a little bit of an overview before you guys start digging into specific picks. So I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes just recapping some of the Cubs context from the 2023 draft while Jeremy hopefully gets his life together cleans his camera lens, does whatever he needs to do. So, Cubs draft. They came in with about 8.8 million in their draft bonus pool. That is the 19th most money in Major League Baseball. They picked at number 13 overall, so did not have a great pool of money. Here's a quick recap of some of their notable and significant selections. Round one, they drafted Matt Shaw, infielder out of Maryland, to full slot. Round 2C, that was a comp pick for Contreras, I believe. They drafted Jaxon Wiggins, a flame-throwing right-handed pitcher out of Arkansas, for an overslot deal, about $400,000 overslot, if I'm not mistaken. Round three, they took Josh Rivera, probably the best senior sign shortstop out of Florida, played exceptionally well in the College World Series. Round four, they took Will Sanders, a really big-bodied starting pitcher out of South Carolina. Round five, Michael Carrico, a catcher out of Davidson. Round six, Alfonso Rosario, an outfielder from P27 Academy, prep player. Round seven, another prep player, Yahil Melendez, a shortstop out of Puerto Rico. And round eight, Brett Bateman, outfielder out of the University of Minnesota. Minnesota represent. That's some of their notable picks in the first 2 days of the draft. So let's start here before we dig into specific names. Jeremy, what did you make of the Cubs' overall approach? How would you kind of characterize their strategy in the 2023 draft?
Yeah, so I covered, I did a recap at Northside Baseball the day or two after the draft, and really my thought was they had to either go about making just a super safe, take the guys that are kind of there, that'll take slot, and just kind of hope that works, or go more on the side of we're gonna shoot for maybe riskier guys with higher ceilings. And I think for the most part, it wasn't like risk of, there wasn't an aversion to that. There are some really safe names in there, but Wiggins, I mean, that's shoot for the moon and hope we land something, right? And then you had these two younger outfielders, or outfielder and a shortstop, which are risky picks. And so I think that's kind of what they did in the top 10. And then they turn around with Zaire Hope, and there's risk there. And so it's certainly not necessarily a balance. They had to take some safer guys with less upside, but really Wiggins is kind of the guy that made this draft what it was. I think they could have done some other ways, and I think when they took him, that kind of set them in the path to go the way that they did.
Yep, absolutely. 100% agree. I think the Cubs really did what they could do with their money and the picks that they had, right? They didn't have a second round pick. They had a second round comp pick. And I agree 100%. I think your headline is spot on. They balanced floor and upside, I think, in a pretty solid way. And we'll dig into their first pick in just a second, but I think they did that in the right order. So let's dig into some of their picks a bit more specifically here. We'll start right at the top. 13th overall pick was Matt Shaw out of Maryland. What did you think of the pick? How do you think he'll fare? And what kind of upside do you think Matt Shaw has? What do you think of him?
Yeah, he was, as I said last week and previously, he was my favorite college infielder.
Yeah.
Is he going to necessarily be a shortstop? I don't know the answer to that. Whenever you go into the Northeast to take a prospect, I think there's extra upside because it's the season, right? And he was a Massachusetts kid, and he's a Maryland college kid. So I think there's just more there. Obviously, the Big Ten is a decent baseball conference, but you get him down into some warmer weather, and dude's batting 378 right now in the minors, and he's at high A. He shouldn't be. He should be a double A, and he should really be knocking on the door at the majors. Maybe not in a year. Well, maybe in a year from now. And I don't know. Like I said, I don't know if he ends up at short or at second, or if he's maybe a left fielder. He does have a little bit of pop. He does steal some bases. He does strike out. So maybe there needs to be some refinement to his approach. But I've really been a big fan of Matt Shaw, and a big fan of that pick for the Cubs, because I thought they did it right at 13. He just kind of fell into their laps, and for me, should be probably in the discussion for number 2 or number 3 in their system.
Yep, I agree. I like the Shaw pick a lot. We're gonna see him kind of like a short, stumpy, right-handed swing, just like he mashes. Has really quick hands. I like him and Tommy Troy were a really similar player type for me. This kind of like Brian Dozier. I hate making comps, but here we go again. This kind of like Brian Dozier player type, right? Which is like good power, shorter stature, not like an exceptional defensive player necessarily, but gonna have like a solid hit tool at least, and like above average to maybe even plus power. So completely agree. Shaw should move fast. I think it was a slam dunk pick at 13. Here's my last question for you on him. Real quick hitter here. Would you have considered, and you can tell me no, let's move on, because I'm putting you on the spot. Would you have considered anyone else at 13?
The hardest thing when that question's asked is you never know what the team's willing to pay and what guys are willing to sign for. And so, I mean, if I'd have to look at the draft order to see exactly how that played out to tell you if there was other guys on the board. But that to me was a really good spot. As I'm pulling this up here,
Kyle Teo 14,
no,
Jacob Gonzalez 15,
no,
Bryce Eldridge 16.
No, I like Enrique Bradfield.
Okay,
he adds and I've said this before, and I'll say it. Speed is going to be a big thing again in baseball at some point, right? And Bradfield's got to figure out how to hit a little bit more. But I feel like, and maybe Vanderbilt's not the right place, because you get good coaching at Vanderbilt, you get good coaching at LSU. But if you can have a guy that can take bases and take away bases, like it's a much bigger deal. We've seen the stolen base come back. And so Bradfield would be a guy that I would have considered. Namala would have been a guy that I would have considered there. But again, that comes down to what are they going to sign for? Bradfield went for slot. Namala went for underslot when I thought he was for sure.
That was a surprise. Yeah.
I know. I thought for sure I thought he was going to the Cubs, and the reason he didn't go to the Cubs is because he wanted more money. And so Matt Shaw for slot at 13, I think it was a great pick for the Cubs. And knowing now what I know, I like that way more than Tommy Troy. Even though Troy signed for underslot, I like Matt Shaw more than Tommy Troy. So I think it was a great pick by the Cubs, and 5 years from now, I might look like an idiot for saying that. But I liked it. I liked it on draft night, and I still like it now.
Right now.
All right. So the next one, we're going to go down to Jaxon Wiggins, and you're going to tell us why we should love that pick. Because when that pick happened, I was like, ooh.
Okay. So Jaxon Wiggins is absolutely a high risk pick in the position in which he was drafted by the Cubs. So if we take a look at the consensus board, he was 128th overall, and the Cubs took him at 68. So by consensus, you might call that a reach, but so was Ryan Jeffers, who hit a massive, important home run for the Twins today. Jaxon Wiggins, right-handed pitcher out of the University of Arkansas. Classic, big, physical frame. 6'6", 225, right-handed, just absolutely explosive stuff. And I think looking at his college numbers from Arkansas will give you a little bit of what the upside is, and also what the challenges are, right? So we're going to specifically look at his 21-22 numbers. 6.55 ERA. ERA is the last thing I would ever look at in college baseball. It is just unimportant. He pitched 66 innings, struck out 82 guys. Right, the stuff is there. It's explosive. It's live. He's throwing in the upper 90s. It's absolutely dominant. 43 walks in 66 innings. So if we come back to our Mizrowski conversation from earlier, right? He has the stuff. Can he harness it? Can he throw it for strikes? Is going to be the question. When he's on, he looks absolutely unhittable on the mound. The question is going to be, can you command the strike zone? If you can command the strike zone, he's going to be a monster. I think that's a really, really big if. If I were the Cubs, I don't know that this is a pick that I would have made at this point at 68. And I don't mean to say that I don't want to take a more of like a risk or reach for a more high upside guy here. Just knowing where they were in terms of picks and money in this draft, I think there were potentially other options. And to take some big shots a little bit further down the board. But that's Wiggins.
Yeah, and so that's my issue with him. I mean, there's questions. It may have been a little bit of a reach, but then you go above slot, and not that what 300,000 is really going to make or break their board or their bank, but Joe Whitman, who I liked more than Wiggins, signed for $600,000 less with the next pick. You get into round 3, and there's so many other pitchers and college guys that would have had not even necessarily pitchers like Jack Hurley. Like, you could have done that. And so that was my issue with that pick. There's certainly upside, and I love upside, but I feel like it wasn't the right upside to go with.
Yep.
And so that's kind of where I was more hesitant on him, just because it, in hindsight, we could look at what kind of set the table for that draft. And that was the pick. And I don't love it.
I don't love that pick either. Only time will tell. I do think this Cubs drafting team has earned a decent amount of credit. So we'll see how Jaxon Wiggins pans out. Okay, so to cap this off, we're each going to pick a guy from a prospect who was drafted in rounds 3 through 10 to make sure we have a little bit of coverage of the mid-range guys, and then we're each going to pick a prospect drafted rounds 11 through 20 just to talk a little bit about them, why they might be an interesting name to track. Jeremy, we'll start with you if you don't mind. Who's your guy, your Cubs pick, drafted in rounds 3 through 10?
So Jonathan Long, 9th round pick out of Long Beach State. Fun university to follow. Great baseball school. He was selected, and they called him a first baseman, I think. He's played 10 games at third base, 5 games at first base. The thing that you're buying with him is the bat. And so far, so good through 39 at bats, 4 home runs, 21 at single A. So that's low A too. He probably should get moved up, but you want to have that success immediately, and a slot guy. So not even like a cheap. He was a legit 9th round pick, and he's totally getting it done so far. So just someone that's in their system that is paying immediate dividends. Here we see a walk-off home run that happened last night where he crushes it.
Love it.
And so just, if he can play third base, there's a ton of value there. If he ends up at first base, the bat plays, and I think those are safe picks, like I mentioned that the Cubs making,
Yep.
and that's really one of my favorites from the top 10.
Yep. Like that one a lot. Mine is going to be kind of a similar vein. Michael Carrico is mine, a catcher out of Davidson. Excuse me, 5th round pick. He was taken at 149th overall by the Cubs. He was 88th on the consensus board. And that was an absolute dearth of catching in this draft. There was nothing. That was like the two guys in the top 20, Teal and Mitchell, and then Carrico was the next guy ranked. He was 88th on the consensus board, drafted 149th overall. So I like this as good value. Obviously, he comes from a smaller school. He had a broken wrist in 2023, which significantly, here we're going to get a look at him now, which significantly put a dent in his playing time. But I want to just speak on some of his 2022 numbers. 54 games in 2022. Here's his triple slash: 456, 559, 843. 843 is the slugging, not the OPS. With 21 home runs, struck out 17% of the time and walked 23% of the time. Just absolutely dominated. Slightly lesser competition. I do think there are some questions with him around like how is that going to look against better velocity and obviously against professional pitching, kind of an uppercut type swing that produces fly balls to all fields. He has like whole field power. Defensively should at least have a decent chance to stick a catcher, and so to take a flyer on a guy like that and basically get 70-ish picks of consensus value feels like a great pick. I'm excited to track him. Michael Carrico is my guy from the mid rounds. Let's move on to rounds 11 through 20. Jeremy, who you got?
So I was following Brian Kelmer, who was a third baseman from Gonzaga, drafted in the 18th round. Just interesting from the perspective that the Cubs went with a lot of third baseman types.
Mm-hmm.
And I have his page pulled up here. The 23-year-old, also at Myrtle Beach, so old for his class, but really has had success, which he should. He's coming from the West Coast Conference where it's not super known for baseball, but batting .342 right now through 73 at bats. Also has 5 home runs, 5 other extra base hits. So slugging percentage is .630. I just think at that point in the draft, round 18, you're taking a shot, right? And so he signed for $50K, which was their lowest bonus. And again, organizational depth at a minimum. His swing looks kind of funky, but I think if there's power there that he can tap into, because I think that swing could be fixed. I mean, it looked like he got heavy on the front foot, and that's just obviously one swing. But if you can fix a little bit of that, I think maybe you have a prospect. At this point, I wouldn't necessarily, put him anywhere near the radar. But I think you got to draft guys like that, and if he can develop into that power, even if he has to move across the diamond, that's something that plays. And lower on the defensive spectrum right now, but someone that's worth watching to me with that 563rd or 36th overall pick.
Love it. I don't know a ton about him, so here for an education. I'm going to go with a guy who's a little bit more of a well-known prospect to be picked this late. Drew Bowser, third base. Funny that you said that. Third baseman out of Stanford. He was a 20th round pick, 596th overall. He was ranked 254th on the consensus board. I was going to lean on that. Feels like some good, solid consensus value. Really put up solid numbers in the Pac-12. Obviously, Stanford have a pretty great program. 18 home runs in 2022, 14 in 2023. Really consistent triple slash in both of those seasons. Off to a decent start in the Arizona Complex League, just 44 at bats for Bowser, but hitting 295 with a 753 OPS, 4 stolen bases already, no home runs, but there's plenty of time for that. And again, like similar commentary, right? 367 on base percentage is really solid for your first 40 professional at bats for a guy that they drafted in the 20th round, and at the very worst, a solid organizational depth piece with a little bit of an opportunity for more. Let's now talk about the strikeout rate.
Okay, right. So there's a lot of strikeouts, and here's what's interesting. Okay, we're gonna just deviate from baseball for a second. I did not think Drew Bowser would sign. I'm like, you might not make more money. Mm-hmm. Go back to school, strike out less, get drafted higher. Okay, Drew Bowser signs for $150,000. His mother is a well-known television producer.
What?
Yeah. So on her list, Yvette Lee Browser, or it's Yvette, Yvett, and now I'm talking, and now I'm going. It doesn't want me to talk, but you're familiar with the show because Hanging with Mr. Cooper was a jam. She was a producer, okay. Right? The Wayans brothers, Living Single, and more recently, Blackish. Like, wow. So, speaking of strikes, there's a strike going on in Hollywood. She's probably part of this, right? She's not making any money. Drew Bowser needs to go pro and support the family. Okay, that's obviously not true, but that's a real thing. Like she's famous.
Wow, I had to do my homework. Apparently, a lot better.
Yeah, that's why you picked her.
He was rocking like 30, 33, 34, 35% strikeout rates in college. That's looking like 50% very early days as a pro. So that's okay. Let's give it a little time.
Okay, all right. Theo says in the chat, producers, they're it's not them. So he didn't need to go pro to make the money. I don't know. I don't have a great pulse. My finger's not on the pulse of Hollywood.
Right on. Okay. We're going to move on from the Cubs draft. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that review. Feel free to send us some feedback ahead of the Brewers next week, especially if you want to bash Jeremy's camera. We're going to finish up with some listener questions and then just a couple of quick news and notes, and we'll get out of here. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to send these in. Thank you, guys. Giving us plenty to talk about and discuss on our first 2 episodes, and we're going to try and get to at least 3 or 4 every episode to keep as much listener interaction as possible. So, first one is going to be hopefully for Jeremy, and it's from Kyle on Twitter. Says, enjoying the show, draft and prospect info regarding the Twins. I know they've drafted some high school arms. I assume he's referring to Charlie Soto, Dylan Quested, etc. But it feels like they don't have a lot in the pipeline, and I assume that he's talking about pitchers to be excited about. Is there something I'm missing, Jeremy?
If we want to talk about just high schoolers, not really. He's not really missing much. I think Marco Rea hopefully gets back on track and could be exciting. Charlie Soto, obviously, there's some excitement to be had there. Dylan Quested, there's some excitement to be had there. Again, a lot of that is you hope that they become big-time dudes. The part about the pitching pipeline, the college pitchers from 2022 are killing it.
Insane.
And again, they're college pitchers, so you sometimes say, well, they come with limited upside, and you're not wrong. But when you take a bunch of college pitchers from like Power 5 schools, the coaching that you get professionally is so much better, right? The velo camp that these guys are doing in the fall, and then they come back in their first full season and they become dudes.
Yep.
Like, that's exciting. And because it's like 5 of them from the same class, to me, that makes it even more exciting. Mm-hmm. And we don't know, is it going to be Is it going to be, trade chips or, whatever? Those are questions that we don't have answers for, but having those guys makes it more fun for me. And let me just add, my camera gets foggier when I click back to our show script. Like when it's white page, I don't know if it's because I'm so pale that it's like the reflection of my screen.
Jesus, maybe you need to print it like you did with the consensus board. Go old school.
Idea. But then you can't change it.
No, this is true. This is true. Okay, sounds good. Next question comes from friend Greg Masterson on Twitter. I'm going to tee this one up for you also, Jeremy. He says, how do you feel about the way that the Twins have handled Marco Raya so far in his pro career, light workload, etc.? So maybe quick context about how they've handled him, and then give your 2 cents.
Yeah, so it's been short starts, right? 2-3 innings. I think there was one of 4. And then there was the train wreck where he had like 3 straight games where he just forgot to get people out. And so it doesn't bother me because like Jackson Ferris, he was the same plan, right? It was like 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, 4 innings. And Ferris has been healthy and he's been there for 1 year. Now Raya, 113 innings in 37 games, but he's had shoulder issues. And so the emphasis on, are we gonna figure out how to command a fastball and add a breaking pitch has to be balanced with we want to limit the bullets that come out. And there's no perfect way. I mean, you look at Dylan Bundy as a Baltimore Oriole, and they treated him with the biggest set of kid gloves in the history of forever.
Yep.
Followed shortly by elbow surgery. And so there's no perfect recipe for how this success is going to happen. But if he can just develop through these 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, 3 innings, the way that he did without that promotion, I think everybody's like, that's the great way to do it. He goes up to Double-A and looks horrible. And now it's like they've screwed him up. And so that's where it becomes, unfair to say one thing versus the other. I have no problem with it. I'd prefer that the arm stays in one piece.
Yep. You? Yep. 100% agree. And nothing really more to add there. I think the research kind of points to if you can get pitchers to a relative state of good health when they're 22, they stand a much better shot of staying healthy in the long run. Someone with actual medical expertise can correct me if I'm wrong there. But absolutely no issue with that. In fact, would encourage a similar approach for Charlie Soto and others. Stay healthy, limit bullets, 100%. Indy 75. Go ahead. Sorry.
Let me read this one to you.
Okay, go for it.
Okay. Indy 75 on Twitter says, what leading people to believe Pete Crow Armstrong has raised his ceiling so drastically? Not doubting, just curious.
Not doubting. So I think Indy 75 is a Brewers fan. I could be wrong. And the reason I bring that up is just curious about some of the verbiage in the question. So let's talk about Pete Crow Armstrong a little bit because I think he's a really fascinating prospect. He was drafted in 2020, COVID-shortened 5-round draft. Producer Theo is saying that if we want to talk about prospects with famous moms, PCA's mom was the mom in Little Big League. What is going on?
You didn't know that.
I don't know. Wow.
Come on, man.
Okay, PCA. 2020 COVID-shortened draft. It was only 5 rounds. He was picked 19th overall out of Harvard Westlake in California, baseball powerhouse school that I'm sure most folks know quite well. 2020, of course, is a COVID year, so he doesn't play. In 2021, he had a torn labrum, I believe. So only played a handful of games, was acquired from the Mets as part of the Javi Baez trade. Javi Baez is now playing Fruit Ninja at the plate for the Detroit Tigers on a regular basis. So that is looking quite nice for the Cubs. So I think like initially with PCA, like a little bit out of sight, out of mind, right? COVID, didn't play, injured, didn't play. But his stock has always been pretty high. So if we look at his numbers from the last two minor league seasons, in 2020, played 101 games, hit 312, 376, 520 with an 896 OPS, 16 home runs, 32 stolen bases. Pretty good. Hit for average, on base, good power, great base runner, good defense. Like it's all the tools. 2023. Now this season's not done. Obviously, he's now in AAA. He's played 90 games so far this year, so 11 short, or probably more now because this was a couple of days ago. Triple slash from this year: 289, 374, 532 with a 906 OPS. So like incredibly similar production moving through the minor league levels. 18 home runs, 2 more than last year, 32 stolen bases, exact same number as last year. So he has, the reason his ceiling is so high is because he continues to put up incredible numbers at every new level that he goes to. All of that with exceptional defense. And I would say that the current top 100 prospects is maybe the weakest it's been in a long time, but PCA is absolutely legit. I'm buying all of the stock. 19 games left for the Iowa Cubs. And he had a little bit of a slow start there, but has that 891 OPS there now. PCA is a monster. I am fully bought in. And I think you should be too.
Can I just add a little bit on him? So
yeah,
MLB.com has him at 12 overall,
okay,
which has him in a group of outfielders that includes Wyatt Langford at 13, Colton
nice.
Cowser at 14, Max Clark at 15, Walker Jenkins at 16.
Very
And
nice.
the Cubs are doing it right because I don't know what the picture is, but instead of having Crow Armstrong all the way across his back from like hip to hip, they have Crow Armstrong. And it
Oh.
looks funky, but it doesn't look stupid like Woods Richards.
Doesn't look like Encarnacion Strand.
He doesn't even do that. They didn't do it. It's just they just did Encarnacion. It doesn't.
Oh, I must be misremembering a Twins minor league.
The Twins did it, but with the Reds, it's just one. He says it's my name, but it's too long.
Got you.
And kudos to him for recognizing that.
Way to go, PCA. You should just write PC. Just do like a Players Weekend or whatever they did when
all the time.
Do a nickname. Yeah, let's roll that way. Last, a couple of quick pieces of news and notes. Jeremy Nolan Shanuel is a Major League Baseball player. WTF? Angels.
Great call, right?
What are your thoughts?
I mean, it's surprising. He's actually on a what 8? Like he's on an 8-game hitting streak or something crazy. Too bad for the Angels because of the whole Ohtani deal and Trout. And if this was really their plan, it's an interesting plan, right? He was considered the closest to the bigs, right? You loved him. Great hitter.
I do.
Funky setup. But it's weird because it you add him to a 40, it starts the clock. He's got to be in the majors pretty much all the time now, right, for this to make sense. But with that being said, it's the Angels, and nothing ever makes sense.
Correct. Agreed. I did love him. I was like a Shanuel absolute stan since the beginning of the college season. I think he had like 3 home runs in one game against Florida, and I was like, oh, dang, like this is really a dude. But he was 25 on the consensus board. I loved him in the 20 to 30, maybe in the like 15 to 20 range. And then he went 11, which was one thing. But then he went 11 and the Angels signed him to full slot, which I was just like absolutely mind boggling. But clearly the plan was to get him signed, immediately get him to start playing for a minor league affiliate. I do not think this is going to work. His exit velocities from his limited minor league sample size do not lend themselves to hitting for power or solid average yet at the major league level. I hope he proves me wrong. But the Angels, I Always keep things interesting. Um, Last piece of news: Walker Jenkins has been promoted to Fort Myers. Jeremy, is this a surprise? He's got a handful of games left to get his feet wet. What do you think the Twins fans should expect from his debut?
So the timing of the promotion was impeccable. I leave work. I'm thinking about Walker Jenkins and what's next. I'm tweeting about it, composing a tweet. I hit send about if the Twins don't put him in low A, it's dumb. They're dumb. And then I scroll like 30 seconds later, he got promoted. Now Theo tells us 0 for 4 tonight. That's fine. Okay. The dude needs at bats. If he would have not got any more at bats, it would have been irresponsible.
Yep.
And so play him for the rest of this year. If he has, unless he looks completely overwhelmed by low A baseball, and he won't, but
No.
unless he does, he should continue playing with the Colonels in the playoffs, because nobody cares if the Midwest League Championship, like if they win the Midwest League Championship, that's cool. But we're into, development, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the best way to develop a guy is to challenge him. And if he checks some of the boxes here at low A, not even all of them, but just looks like he can handle a week or two at high A, let him do it. Because what we're seeing more and more and more and more is that we're going to get guys to the major leagues quicker. There's the prospect promotions incentives. There's, keeping it makes too much sense to not do it. And so we saw Walker Jenkins get promoted. We saw Max Clark get promoted. And I think it's going to be lockstep with those guys. And it's responsible management of prospects.
Yep.
Just like we're seeing pitchers not throw, responsible taking care of prospects. And so hitters, give them experience. Pitchers, make sure they're good. He can go 0 for 4, and it's, whatever. But he has to be doing that. And good on him, because he deserved that look. And you slam on the brakes if it's bad, but he's been good. And so I'm a little more surprised that Winokur didn't go with him.
Yep. Yeah, Winokur, who was rocking a decently high strikeout rate, but I think we all expected that, but had produced some really strong OPS in his stint with the FCL Twins. So kind of agree. Jenkins was really impressive, man. I think he only struck out like 8 times in his time with the FCL Twins. So I agree wholeheartedly. Give the guy at bats. He's I think he started in center field tonight too. Get him playing time on defense. Give him exposure. I don't care if he goes over 50. He's gonna have to do low A at some point. So let's get that started right now.
Absolutely.
All right. I think it's time for us to wrap up for episode 2. Want to finish by thanking you guys for checking us out. Thank you guys for listening or watching, whatever your preferred is. Big shout out and thank you to producer Theo behind the scenes for keeping everything running smoothly. We appreciate you. As always, send us your feedback. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us positive reviews on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you guys next week. Until then, have a good one.